Okay, I'm not sure what your time says, but mine says 1:30. So good morning, not good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Trauma Informed Strategies, our session with Beth Whittle. My name is Trisha Goga, and I'm your host for this session. A few friendly reminders during the session. Please make sure your microphone is turned off so that it does not disrupt the session. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat or save them until the very end for the Q&A session. Please complete the session feedback form on the Whova app or website in your agenda, and you will receive a conference survey on March 11th. And thank you so much for attending the session. Beth, take it away.
Hi, everybody. I'm Beth Whittle. I'm the Executive Director of Counseling and School-Based Mental Health Integration at the State Department of Education. Before I jump into my presentation, I had a couple of additional housekeeping things for you guys. I wanted to direct you to the student support website on the OSDE webpage. Our office has exploded in the last year and a half, and we have so many resources available to not only school counselors, but all school-based mental health professionals that are extremely valuable at any time, not just during our current situation. So we have crisis supports, we have bullying prevention supports, we also have a person who's specifically designated to comprehensive school counseling. So if there's anything that you need that's not reflected on our webpage, please reach out to me and let me know. But we have tried to do a really good job of curating resources from all of our national partners, not only during the pandemic and the occurrences with racial tension for districts to use and give to their families, but also in a multitude of other areas such as school climate transformation and prevention. So all of those resources are readily available for you to steal and share at will. And if there's anything that you think would be valuable that's not already up, please let us know. We also have a school-based mental health integration and counseling newsletter that we send monthly. So if you're not signed up for that, please do so. We send out resources regarding crisis preparedness and response, school psychology, school counseling best practice, as well as mental health integration in schools, upcoming events and resources every month. So if we get it and think it's valuable, you guys get it. So make sure you sign up for that. And then also my PowerPoint is really long and it was too big to upload to the Whova app. So if you would like a copy of my PowerPoint, Trisha's gonna pop my email in the chat box. So just shoot me an email and I am happy to send you my entire presentation. I know they said this in the opening slides, but for our licensed folks on the line, the CEUs this year, since COVID, the State Board of Behavioral Health has put a moratorium on approving those. So when you get your certificate of attendance, it won't look like what you're used to, but you can submit that with your licensure renewal and they will accept it for your hours. So if you were in my session last year, because there were a ton of people in that session, this might seem a little familiar to you, but I will let you know that I have included several resources that you can help your teachers in regarding having a culturally responsive classroom and addressing racial trauma, as well as trauma-informed strategies for the virtual space. So whereas some of it might seem similar, there is a whole lot of new content woven throughout. And lastly, I would be remiss to acknowledge your role and what you do for all of your students. You are the bridge between physical and psychological safety for all of your students. And I know it's been a really tough year. So I hope that what I present to you today is helpful. And if there's any additional information you need, our office is here to resource you and support you and nothing else. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions or concerns. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. You'll notice that I jumped through my presentation a little bit because, like I said, it is really long. But because I want to leave questions for you all at the end. Okay, so this is one of my favorite quotes, and it's by Matthew Portell. He's a principal, and he said, "Trauma-informed education is a journey and not a checklist. There's no magical program that's going to fix kids because we're not fixing kids. We're supporting them in being successful." So I want you to have that as your lens as you're going into this presentation. So as listed in the session description, understandably, I wanted everyone in this session to already have an understanding of ACEs, because I'm not going to go over what ACEs are and chronic stress and how it affects learning. But I am going to talk a lot about how we can help students who've experienced chronic stress and trauma. So students who've experienced trauma, they have a difficulty trusting others. Sometimes they're socially isolated. They have a difficult time seeking help, and they also might have a hypersensitivity to physical contact. Sometimes they have an increase in medical, emotional, and mental problems, and they also might have problems with coordination and balance. This one's really interesting to me, and it comes from where stress hormones are released in the brain when we go through a stressful event. It happens in several parts of the brain, but one of them is the cerebellum, and that's the part of our brain that handles motion and coordination and balance. So this is something that's really important. You can talk to your PE teachers about, or anybody who's on duty during an unstructured time, and a student might seem triggered because maybe they can't throw the ball right, or they just can't get it through the hoop. It might not be a lack of physical skill, but it might be a trauma response due to having excess amounts of cortisol released in that cerebellum. So students who've experienced chronic stress may also have poor affect regulation, problems with academic achievement, oppositional and antisocial behaviors, and have a difficulty planning for the future. None of this is new to you guys. So one of the things I always like to say when I'm talking about chronic stress and trauma is that resilience is greater than ACEs. Students don't initially have resilience, but we can instill it in them by having an understanding of what chronic stress is and how it affects learning, by creating environments where children feel safe, both physically and emotionally, and helping them to identify their feelings and manage emotions. So when we're talking to teachers about trauma and chronic stress, sometimes they have a tendency to over focus on what students have experienced chronic stress and what they've experienced. But what we as counselors can do is really help teachers focus on the strategies that we use are helpful for all students. And that takes the pressure off of educators to feel like they have to identify which students have been through trauma and what they've experienced. So before I jump into strategies that are coachable for your teachers, not only in in-person learning, but also in the virtual space, I want to explain a little bit about the brain basics, because this is really valuable information you can bring back to your teachers, and also that you can teach kids. So when we think about trauma and chronic stress and how chemicals affect our brain, there are three main areas of the brain that stress hormones affect, and that's the neocortex, the limbic brain, and the brainstem. So the neocortex, that's in the front part of our skulls, and that's in charge of higher order thinking. This is where we need kids to be to take on new information, to process consequences, essentially to learn. If a student is stressed out, their brain is flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and then they flip into that limbic brain. I always think of the term, they flip their lid. So when they flip into the limbic brain, this is the emotional center of the brain. This might be where a teacher sees a desk go flying, or in your counseling office, the sand tray goes against the wall. If we're not able to regulate kids, they can continue to have those stress hormones flood their brain, and then they end up in the brainstem. And this is the survival part of the brain. This is where we see fight, flight, or freeze. So this might be why you keep your running shoes under your desk where you're chasing a student. Or this is when you see a student fight back. Or maybe they freeze, they seem to be catatonic or dissociated. So it's our job as counselors to help regulate students, and also to help teach our teachers how to regulate students within their classroom. That way we can focus more on that tier 1 prevention for our kids, and we're spending less time on that tier 3 crisis response. So this is adapted from Help for Billy, which is by Heather Forbes. And this is a really great tool that counselors can help teachers understand regarding how students present in their classrooms. So you see on the left, we have Maxine, and on the right, we have Max. So when students are operating within the window of stress tolerance, they're having stress hormones flood their brains, but they're still able to remain in that neocortex because they have that resiliency factor. But all students don't have the same window of stress tolerance based on past experiences. So when you look at this, if you pop into the chat, who do you think has had a trauma history, Maxine or Max, based on how large their window of stress tolerance is? And Trisha, what's the overarching consensus?
It looks like Max.
And that's correct. So when we talk to teachers about the window of stress tolerance, if they come into our offices frustrated saying, I don't know why one student can handle Max sitting next to them tapping his pencil, but another student can't handle Max sitting next to them tapping their pencil and a desk goes flying, that's because that student has a smaller window of stress tolerance. So that could be a red flag for us as counselors to maybe check in on the student and see what's going on at home, things like that. And that's just another way of explaining what I just said if you ask for my PowerPoint later. So this is from Dr. Bruce Perry, and I love the concept of state-dependent function because it illustrates the importance of not only student regulation in the classroom, but also teacher regulation in the classroom. And I think it's our job as counselors to not only teach students how to regulate, but also teachers, because we know as counselors that we are counselors to our teachers sometimes just as much as we're counselors to our students. So students' abilities to learn and faculty's abilities to teach are not the only things that are affected by dysregulation. So when students are operating in their limbic brain, that emotional center, or the brainstem, that fight, flight, or freeze center, their fine motor skills and speech can be impacted due to the way that nerves are dysregulated in different areas of the brain. So this is a really interesting thing that we can teach teachers to look out for, but something else that we can look out for. If a student normally has really great penmanship, but one day it's just all over the place, we might know that that student is operating in a different part of their brain due to stress hormones, and that's a flag to check in on them. Same thing with speech. If I have a student who normally is really calm and collected and tends to be very, articulate, and one day they come in and they're extremely verbose and they seem agitated, they might have their speech impacted due to the way that stress hormones are affecting their brain. So another thing that we can help teachers look out for, specifically in the virtual space, and something that we can look out for if we're counseling in the virtual space, is dissociation. So it's one of the brain's most powerful forms of regulation. And most people use this as their predominant mode of regulation. I don't know about you, but since the pandemic, sometimes I find myself just staring out the window and I wonder, how long have I been staring out the window and I don't even know what I am looking at? And that's my brain just trying to regulate my stress. So when you consider that, and when you consider a teacher coming to you saying, they just never listen, they ignore me, how would that change how you coach that teacher to deal with that student? It might be that they're not ignoring the teacher. It might be not that they're not listening. Maybe they're trying to regulate themselves without flipping further down into the brainstem. So instead of saying, stop tapping that pencil, pay attention, it might be a time to do a regulatory activity with that student to get them back to where they're functioning. So I love the concept of neuroplasticity because it's one of the main concepts of hope. So neuroplasticity is creating new neural pathways to stress response by using new interventions, not only in the classroom, but also in our counseling office. So explaining this to students is a really great way of teaching students that change takes time, but they can restructure their brains to new stress response outcomes. And it, like I said, it gives them hope. So I'll give you an example of the backwards bike. I used to tell my kids this all the time and they loved it. And when teachers worked with students on concepts that they couldn't necessarily grasp right away and they get frustrated, they could explain this concept of neuroplasticity through the backwards bike example. So I had the opportunity to go to a conference and hear from a gentleman who was at a pilot school in Portland, and he had all students who had experienced an ACE score of 8 or higher. So he had 10 boys in middle school and who were all ACEs of 8 or higher. And he was trying to explain this concept of neuroplasticity to them. And their response is, whatever, this is the way we've reacted our entire lives because it's what keeps us safe. This is our pattern of stress response because it keeps us safe. And he would say, yes, but you can restructure your brain to more healthy patterns of stress response. No, we can't. It's just the way we've always been. So he goes home over the summer and let me back up. So he brings a bike to school and he asks the students, how many of you think that you can ride this bike backwards? And so what do a ton of middle school boys do? They start posturing, right? I can do it. No, you can't. I can do it. No, you can't. And so he says, okay, do it. And one at a time, they get on the bike, and one at a time, they just fall over. And then what do they say? This is impossible, right? The same thing they said about restructuring their brains to more positive stress response outcomes. So he goes home over the summer and he teaches himself to ride the bike backwards through short interventions every day, through these short neuroplastic exercises. So he teaches himself to ride his bike backwards. And he goes back to school the next year. Kids aren't in his class anymore. So he goes around and rounds them up, brings them outside. And he says, nothing. He just gets on the bike and rides it backwards. And he says, this is what I'm talking about. This is neuroplasticity. Through short pattern responses, I was able to rewire that pathway that had been created my entire life to ride that bike forward, to also be able to ride the bike backward. And through this example, he was able to get his students to buy into the interventions he was trying to teach them to mitigate the negative outcomes of the chronic stress they'd experienced in the past. So some different neuroplasticity exercises you can use in your counseling office, but also that teachers can use in their classrooms that you can coach them on are ABC 1, 2, 3, rock, scissors, math, story starters, ping pong, visualizing colors with deep breathing, and rise and fall deep breathing for littles. So what these exercises are and what they do is they assess trauma sensitivity and how reactive a student is to a threat. And then they fine tune the brain to less sensitivity. And in doing so, it balances the nervous system to reduce those stress hormones in the brain. So that's a lot of words to say. The easy way to do that is through movement and executive function at the same time. We want to reintegrate the shutdown areas of the brain that are overwhelmed by stress hormones. And that's typically the neocortex, where they need to be thinking, and the cerebellum that handles movement and coordination. So if we can get kids moving and thinking in sync, then we are practicing neuroplasticity. Lots of big words for something kids end up thinking is fun. So my favorite one is ABC 1, 2, 3. And this is a lot more fun in person because I make everybody get up and do it, but I can't do that now. But what ABC 1, 2, 3 is you say the ABCs, and as you say it, you draw the corresponding number to the letter in the air. You could do this in the virtual space with kids with the whiteboard function on Zoom. You could have them say the ABCs and draw 1. As they say A, say B, draw 2. But essentially what it looks like is A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I'm not going to go through the whole alphabet, but you get the point. We want them to be moving and thinking at the same time, and that helps to reintegrate those parts of the brain that aren't firing together anymore. So if we can assist students in staying in the neocortex through these little activities through the day, we're teaching them strategies that they can use outside of school when we're not there to support them. Okay, I'm going to skip this, but please go back and watch it if you get my PowerPoint, because it talks about co-regulation and the best way to do it in the classroom and how you can teach teachers to do it in the classroom. Okay. So I don't know how many high school folks I have on the phone or on the Zoom, but I think this is applicable to everyone that deals with any sort of career and college readiness guidance with students. So through the research of Dr. Chan Hellman, we know that resilience is bouncing back from negative life events and that hope is wanting more out of life. So through his research, he's found that higher hope individuals do better in life than lower hope individuals. No surprise there. But what else he found was that hope scores are a bigger predictor of college success than ACT or SAT scores. And that higher hope kids actually have a greater influence over lower hope kids than other lower hope kids. So when we coach teachers on how to group students around different activities, and when we're thinking about how we structure our small groups with students, we know which of our students have a growth mindset, which ones are hopeful about the future, and which ones don't. So if we can group those higher hope kids with the lower hope kids, they can actually statistically increase the hope scores of those lower hope kids. So I think that's really interesting research and very applicable to our practice. So Dr. Hayes Grudo out of Oklahoma State University, we know about ACEs, but she came up with PACEs. And PACEs are protective and compensatory experiences for youth. And there's 10 of them. They're broken down in relationships and resources. So I'm going to flip back and forth through these slides. And as I do, I want you to look at them and I want you to count how many you think the school as a system can influence in students. So I'll give you just a couple seconds on relationships and then I'll flip to the next one while I mute my email because I feel like you guys can keep hearing it ding. Sorry about that if that was annoying to you guys. Okay, got your number? Moving on. Okay, so if you pop into the chat, how many of you think that the school as a system can influence in students? And then Trisha, once you get a couple responses, let me know what the consensus is.
We have a few trickling through. So far, I have a few 10s and a few 9s.
Yep, and that tends to be what we get. And so just with this research through Dr. Hayes Grudo, what she found was in having these PACEs, students can actually lower the negative health outcomes of traumatic experiences. So just knowing that and the power that we have as schools to mitigate the negative health outcomes of trauma and ACEs in students is very powerful. And I also think about how many of these ICAP touches. You think about mentoring, you think about peer relationships, you think about connection to the community through work-based learning. They all touch these PACEs. So we have so much power, and it's evidenced through research that what we do works and is important. I'm going to fly through this because it's no news to any of you, but there are 4 critical steps to implementing trauma-informed instruction. So as mentioned earlier, we want to allow the student to de-escalate and regulate before solving the issue at hand. If students are in that brainstem or in that limbic brain, they can't process consequences. We have to get them regulated and back into that neocortex before we can process a consequence or a misbehavior. And it's never about the current issue. It goes much deeper. So when I talk to teachers about this as a counselor, I have them think about an iceberg. It's not Billy's not trying to get at you. What you're seeing presenting in the classroom is not him trying to bug you most of the time. It goes a lot deeper. You're not seeing a lot of the things that have happened to him or what might have happened to him before he went to school today. And like I explained before, it's a brain issue, not a behavioral one. And this is the hardest one, I think, especially for administrators to grasp, is that discipline's to teach, not to punish. And when I explain this, I say, what is the root word of discipline? It's disciple. It's to lead, it's to teach. That's what discipline should be for, teaching new patterns of behavior. So I would be remiss not to include this in the PowerPoint, because I know being in the building, especially if you're in-person learning, that you're having students come to you after seeing all of the racial tension and trauma that has happened over the last year in addition to the pandemic. So I not only wanted to give you tools as counselors for dealing with students who come to your office who've experienced microaggressions or macroaggressions regarding racism, but also tools that you can bring to your teachers regarding students who've experienced racial trauma. So racial trauma, the standard definition, is a form of race-based stress, and it refers to Black and Indigenous people of color's reactions to dangerous events of real or perceived experiences of racial discrimination. Such experiences may include threats of harm or injury, humiliating and shameful events, or witnessing other discrimination of people within their community. It's similar to PTSD, but racial trauma is unique in that it involves ongoing individual and collective injuries to exposure of trauma. And I think what's really interesting when we think about racial trauma, when you think about ACEs, it's all about, were you a witness to domestic violence? Was there substance abuse in your home? Did you experience sexual abuse? But when you think about racial trauma, it's not what might have really happened to you. It can also be what you have perceived to have happened to you. So when we think about this and how we think, oh, I didn't see that on the camera, or this student didn't fill out that on their incident report. When we think about racial trauma, it can impact kids even if it's a perceived experience. So when we think of race-based trauma, it's important to think about it in terms of fight, flight, or freeze. So when we think about it in the terms of fight, we might hear teachers or colleagues or other students say, racism doesn't exist at my school. This is a fight response to being uncomfortable with the topic of race. We could hear students say, all lives matter. Well, this is a freeze response to being uncomfortable dealing with topics of race. Or the flight response. We just avoid having conversations about it altogether. And in my opinion, this is one of the worst because it really minimizes the experiences of our students. But we also need to have considerations for our secondary traumatic stress and what we take on and our own biases in helping students through this process. So Danita White from Tulsa Public Schools, she's awesome. And she broke it down really simply. The best thing we can do is name, notice, and disrupt. And this is the best way that we can mitigate racial trauma in our schools. And helping teachers know these three main steps can also be really powerful. So we don't need to be afraid to name what we see. And then we need to notice that the experiences that are brought to us, even if we might not think it's true to them. And if they perceive it to be true, that's their truth. And disrupt. We need to make the changes necessary to have every kid feel safe at our school. So some different tools that you can use in talking to your teachers about mitigating racial trauma. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you get my slides later, you can read through them. But it's all about focusing on positive perspectives on all parents and families. And then if you go through these later, I've got some different examples of things you can do, some different strategies. Communicating high expectations for all students. Learning within the context of culture. And then some more examples of the way you can do these things in your lessons within classrooms and things you can help your teachers do as well. Having student-centered instruction, and this also goes back to a sense of agency, which leads to resiliency, which is very important for students who've experienced trauma. And also culturally mediated instruction. And then lastly, reshaping our curriculum. So including cooperative learning strategies. This goes back to Chan Hellman's research and increasing those HOPE scores and grouping kids appropriately. Having students research aspects of a topic within their community. When they're invested in it, they're going to be more invested in their learning experience. All of these things are best practice for us as counselors and educators and things we can coach our teachers on, but we might not know in doing so that we're mitigating trauma experiences for students. And we want the teacher to always be the facilitator and the counselor to be the facilitator within their small groups. And always celebrate generational resiliency and joy. Intergenerational trauma is real, but that doesn't mean that resiliency is not. So I always want to end this with having humility. Talking about race as a white person is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. But we have to have humility and know that we're not always going to get it right all the time. I had the most uncomfortable experience with one of my colleagues, and she called me out. She was like, "You totally said that wrong." And instead of being, defensive, I was like, "Thank you for telling me. Now I know better." So having humility and being willing to talk and put things out there really shows people that you're able to have those courageous conversations, and that goes a long way into fighting racism in our community. It's just the willingness to mess up and be corrected and do better next time. That's what we teach our kids. Okay. So one of the things that's really important that we can talk to educators about, specifically in the virtual space, and you guys know this as counselors, is the power of one therapeutic moment, right? So teachers always think that, oh, therapy's for the counselors. I can't have that therapeutic moment. I'm not a counselor. I need to just send them to the office so they can talk to the counselor. If we equip our teachers in knowing that a therapeutic moment can exist without a counselor, then we're giving them the tools to increase student agency and to really help, especially students who've experienced trauma, gain those positive relationships that they might be lacking. So Dr. Perry says, the more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agency of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. So I love this, but I'm going to skip it because you guys are counselors and you probably already know it, but I am going to go, well, no, I'm going to go back. So when we think about trauma, the old mindset for student misbehavior is he's so defiant, or she's choosing this behavior. What's wrong with him? I don't need to call home. They won't help. I was so guilty of that as a counselor. And I won't tolerate disrespect. But a new way of thinking could be maybe they're lacking social skills, or maybe they're reacting with adrenaline and survival skills. Calling home might give more insight. When we think about students who've experienced chronic stress and trauma, many of them have embedded negative core beliefs. Research shows down to as young as pre-K. And it's heartbreaking to think that PK kids might think that they'll never be good enough and that they'll always be the bad kid. Everyone in my class can do this except for me, right? But this is their core belief. This is what they feel about themselves. When we respond with things like, that's not true, you're really smart, or don't say things like that, it's silly, we are challenging that negative core belief, and we are driving disconnection, because that's making our students feel like we don't understand them. So some more positive things we could say, wow, that can't feel very good. You guys know that one as counselors. Tell me more about why you're feeling this way, right? But as much as these things seem common sense to us as counselors, if you look at those unproductive responses, I know if we were in a room and you weren't shy, we've all been guilty of all of those. Okay. So two really great tools adopted from Heather Forbes. And if you were at our MTSS conference and got an opportunity to hear her speak, you know she's great, are affirmations and mantras. And I think that these are really powerful, especially with a lot of our students coming to school not feeling safe because of the pandemic. So these two strategies bring students back to a safe sense of reference. I only have 15 minutes. So affirmations are a way to upgrade that negative programming in the mind and change those negative core beliefs by replacing them with empowering and energizing statements. So the trick to these, though, is repetition. In order to really embed those at the subconscious, it has to be repeated. Repetition will help embed these positive senses of self and overcome those negative self-talks. So here are a couple examples. And then mantras are really helpful when a crisis occurs, or maybe a drill and you have a large amount of students who are dysregulated, because again, it brings them back to that stable point of reference. But the important thing about mantras is to coach students on them when they feel safe. That way, when they're dysregulated, by repeating the mantra, it reminds them of when they learned it, when they felt safe. So again, power and repetition, coaching them on it when they feel safe. Here's an example. A good thing about mantras, a good practice, is to have your students come up with them themselves. That way they collectively have their own voice when maybe you have an active shooter drill, or maybe you have a tornado drill and your class is dysregulated. They are now saying the words that they came up with together when they all felt safe, to bring them back to collectively feeling safe again. Okay. So top-down versus bottom-up interventions, clinically speaking, are really important because they help us to balance our cognitive processing. And essentially what this is we want to engage that brainstem before we want to engage our neocortex. So what these strategies do is they synchronize our endocrine system to help proper functioning within our brain. And that's a lot of really big words to say. Go back to neuroplasticity, movement, executive function, but always movement first, bottom up. So some body-based coping skills. This is a bottom-up strategy that kids do just on their own, and we all have them. You guys have seen me probably go like this quite a bit. It's something that we do a lot of the time, not knowing that we're doing it, to help balance our central nervous system. And in doing that, we're regulating stress hormones in our brain. So something we can do with students if they're agitated and in our counseling office is we can point those out and say, hey, I see you're tapping your foot right now. I'm really proud of you. You know, you're regulating yourself, right? You don't have to go back and be gestalt and say, what's your leg telling about you? But you can point out that they are having agency over taking care of reducing those stress hormones in their brain. Like, their bodies know what to do. They just might not know it. So we can also help students maybe in a one-on-one or a small group with students who might have anger problems or oppositional issues. We can have them take their heart rates when they come into our offices and are completely dysregulated, and we can have them graph it. And then we can do a regulatory activity with them, and then have them take their heart rate again, and then graph it again. And then we can ask them to do this throughout the day as well, and they can see when they're becoming more dysregulated. This is another great technique or strategy that can be done virtually, and you can coach your math teachers on, because it's not only helping teach students how to regulate, but it's also teaching core content. So allowing students to have sensory and regulatory breaks, that's no surprise to you. A lot of students come into our offices just because they need a sensory or regulatory break. That's why we have squish balls. That's why we have sandboxes. Tying content to rhythm and interest. So this can be really helpful in the virtual space because we know a lot of our students become disengaged, but dosing and spacing is important. And a lot of really great counselors and educators do this already, but they don't know that they're doing a trauma-informed strategy. So it's all about fact, story, principle. So when we're processing facts, stories, and principles, they all happen in different parts of our brain. So if we bounce between them in different units of time, 15 minutes a piece, we're keeping students moving around into the different parts of their brain, and that keeps them engaged and regulated. If we focus on giving too many facts, this is what depression is, right? But maybe we tell them what depression might be. We tell them a story about maybe a character in a story who'd experienced it. And then we tie it to the overarching principle of self-care and noticing when you're struggling. But we do those in different units of time, as opposed to just talking to them about what depression is, or just reading them the entire story if it's longer than 15 minutes, or talking to them about self and soul care for the entire time they're in your office. You guys know all that. Some different other strategies that you guys can use as counselors or coach your teachers on are zones of regulation, having predictable environment, structure and routine. You can do informal FBAs and BIPs with students, even if they're not on an IEP. Structured breaks, sensory structured breaks, having visual schedules for students. Social skills sessions with counselors are really great. And I don't know if you guys have heard of the resource Overcoming Obstacles, but there's a link to it at the end of my presentation. It is a great tool. I felt like it was my golden goose when I was in the building. But what it is, it's completely free. You create an account when you go online and you type in the student's grade level, and then you type in the presenting problem, and it automatically gives you all of the lessons to use as a counselor that you can also give to teachers to use in their classrooms to help process behaviors and more positive outcomes. So instead of going to Teacher Pay Teacher or Pinterest or whatever, this is a database of evidence-based lessons that educators and counselors have all come up with that you can download in both English and Spanish. Okay, Trisha, how am I doing on time? 3 minutes? Okay, I really want to get to this. Okay, so 3 main strategies for trauma-informed distance learning: regulate, relate, and reason. And again, I know I'm a Bruce Perry nerd, but this is based off of his neurosequential model. So we want to begin our interactions and lessons and counseling lessons with students with a grounding and centering exercise that help them focus on what's happening, not only in their surroundings, but also how what's happening in their surroundings is affecting how they feel in their mind and body. And we want to create structure and consistency through our lessons and have regularly scheduled communication. And I know this is really hard as counselors because you have so many kids. And then we also want to create more opportunities for breaks and physical activities. These are great things to share with your teachers as well. Helping students to regulate, again, maybe through some of those neuroplasticity exercises I discussed earlier. And also relate. You guys know this one. Co-regulation. We want to model positive interactions. It all comes down to the mirror neurons and joint attention that are so important in that counselor-student relationship. And we want to be realistic and gentle about creating a new normal with our students and families. I kind of blew through the end there. I'm sorry, guys. It was really long. That's probably why I couldn't upload it to Whova. But I'm happy to stay late if anybody has questions. And it looks like there's a lot in the chat, but I know I asked for some feedback. So Trisha?
It looks like the only question you have is at the very end. What is the database called? that you referenced.
Overcoming obstacles. And it is right there. If I spelled obstacles right, I didn't. I missed an S. Spell obstacles right, and then you'll get it. Shoot me an email. I'll put my email in the chat, and then I'll send it to you. It was too long to upload to Whova, so I'll just send you an email with it attached as a PDF, and you can take it and steal and use it well.
I'll leave a few more minutes for questions in the chat box. Thank you, Beth. And thank you for everyone for coming to this session. Remember to please complete the session feedback form on the Whova app or website or in your agenda, and you will receive a conference survey on March 11th. Beth and I will both stay on to help answer or direct any of your questions. I don't see any more questions coming through, Beth. And it looks like we have people starting to leave, so we can go ahead and end this session. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and hope to see you in the brief closing comments session.
Bye-bye. Thanks, guys.